In our final lecture of this module, we are going to be talking about the in-between markets. So far what we've talked about has been the purely competitive markets and those monopoly markets. And as I said, it's not always going to be one end of the spectrum or the other. There's going to be things that happen in between. And that's exactly what we're referring to here. So we can think about what we've talked about so far as if this is a spectrum of competitive versus non-competitive, we would see our perfectly competitive firms falling all the way over here. And forgive me for my messiness in my writing. This is one of the first times I'm actually using my whiteboard edition here. So on one end of the spectrum, we have a monopoly, and on the other end, we have those perfectly competitive markets. And what we're going to talk about in this section are these in-between markets. So it's not very common to find a market that's going to be perfectly competitive because we have to have many sellers that are selling the exact same thing. And in the previous lecture, we talked about milk, but still, some people believe that their milk brand is better than another milk brand. And so a perfectly competitive market, it's close, but it might not be exactly the case. And a monopoly, it's always hard to find a single seller with no substitutes. So we talked about the loneliest road in America, but we have alternatives to energy, and there might be another way that somebody can come up with the gasoline that they need to get where they need to go. And so even though we're talking about very close to, it might not be quite perfect. And so what we're going to be talking about in this section is going to be first monopolistically competitive firms and then oligopolies. And that's how they're going to fall. Monopolistically competitive, they're not perfectly competitive firms. They do have some characteristics that are going to move them towards a monopoly, but we still see many sellers. We still see a lot of competition going on. Oligopoly, they're not all the way to a monopoly, but there are a much smaller number of sellers than a monopolistically competitive and a competitive firm. And that's going to be very important to remember as we go forward, is that these in-between markets, they are more realistic to what occurs in the real world. All right, so first off, talking about monopolistically competitive markets. Again, similar to perfectly competitive, but let's talk about how they're different. So let's talk specifically about the market for paper towels. When you go into the paper towel aisle of the grocery store or of your favorite store, there are tons of different brands of paper towels. There's going to be the store brand, and then there's some lower cost brands like Sparkle, and then there's Bounty and Via and Scott, those more expensive brands. So we have many different brands, but they try to differentiate themselves. And so we can see some prices here that the value brand, 69 cents, compared to more than $1 more for Bounty. So double the price for Bounty compared to that store brand. And so we see big differences in price, and we see that they try to differentiate themselves, and they say, Bounty, I'm the quicker picker up, or I'm better than that average brand. And you can know when you see those advertisements, they're trying to differentiate themselves and say that this is a better product. You should be willing to pay more for my product because it's a better product. Automatically, when you hear advertisements like that, you should think monopolistically competitive. They're trying to differentiate themselves from their competitors. All right, so let's go through those comparison purposes, answer those questions. Again, the number of sellers, relatively large. When we walked on that paper towel aisle, there is a large number of sellers. We have a lot of choices in this market. We do see that they have some control over price. There is some control over price, but narrow limits. So it's not that they have complete control. They can't charge a significant amount over what their competitors are. But if they can convince the buyers that their product is different and better in some way, it allows them to have a limited control over the price. We still see relatively easy entry and exit in our monopolistically competitive market. So similar again to our perfectly competitive market. It's relatively easy. It might not be as easy as the perfectly competitive, but still relatively easy. And here is where we see a big difference between our perfectly competitive and our monopoly. There are brands and substitutes and that should say exist in this market. Brands that try to differentiate themselves and say we are better than the others in the market. Okay, and since companies want to differentiate their product, advertising is incredibly important to monopolistically competitive markets. So what we don't see is advertising isn't that important for perfectly competitive markets. In the market for milk, we don't often see many milk brands advertising because 1 gallon of milk is very similar. A lot of customers don't differentiate between milk. However, paper towels, we see many different commercials trying to attempt to convince you that their paper towel brand are better than other paper towel brands. And so a distinguishing feature I want you to think about, does this firm or do these firms advertise? If we have many firms and they're never advertising something like agricultural products, then we don't really see that differentiation. But in a market where we have many sellers and a lot of advertising, this is where we're going to see monopolistically competitive markets come in and have some ability to control prices. So how exactly can firms differentiate themselves from others? So first is to talk about quality differences. So there's some sort of product attribute that makes their product different. In terms of paper towels, it's the quicker picker-upper. I can pick up, I can use fewer paper towels and clean up my mess faster. The quality is higher with this product. And so you should be willing to pay more for my product. Physical attributes. The product appears nicer. It's better looking than its competitors. And that can also drive people to be willing to pay more for the product. Customer service. So again, it's not always just about the quality of the product and the look, but the customer service as well. And so some companies take great pride in providing their customers with customer service. So Best Buy is one of the companies that come to mind off the top of my head. So we have many different sellers selling, electronics like Best Buy, right? Walmart, Target, all of those places I can go buy a computer. But not all of them provide the service of the Geek Squad. And so Best Buy tries to differentiate themselves from others, saying you should pay more for a computer at Best Buy, even though you can buy the same one at Walmart, because if your computer breaks, we'll send somebody out to fix it. And it's that customer service that they're trying to use to differentiate their product. Accessibility and location. And this is where we start to see something like the difference between Walgreens and Walmart. Walmart can offer much lower prices than Walgreens. However, there's a Walgreens on every corner. It's easily accessible. There's many locations. The locations are prime. They're on your way home from work or school. And they have great locations, but they pay more for those locations, and that requires them to charge a premium, or they have the ability to charge a premium for their product, because I want to just run in and grab what I need and run out. And they can charge a higher price because they have better locations. Finally, brand name and packaging. So Pepsi and Coke, 2 examples. Soda is a great example when we're starting to think about brand recognition and packaging. Celebrity association, the wording on the package, this fancy packaging, all providing with a differentiating product. So there might be a cola brand versus a Pepsi, and I'm willing to pay more for Pepsi because I recognize the brand, I know the celebrity that's on the package, the wording on the package makes me think that their product is better, and maybe it comes in a nice case or something like that, all allowing me to differentiate your product from somebody else's, and I can charge a higher price when that differentiation occurs. And since these firms have the ability to differentiate their products, it allows for some control over prices. So firms can then say, my product is better than everybody else's, so you should be willing to pay a little bit more, a premium for my product. And so that's how we're starting to move away from that perfectly competitive market. So yes, we do have to pay a higher price when we're thinking about monopolistically competitive products. However, there is product variety. So firms must constantly manage this product differentiation. In order to keep charging this higher price, they have to manage their product. They have to ensure that they're still maintaining that same quality, that improved quality, or that customer service standard. And they have to make sure that customers are aware of it. If customers don't know the quality of your product is better, then they're not going to be willing to pay more for it. And so managing your price, managing the quality, the differentiation of your product, and then managing your advertising and ensuring customers know there's a difference is going to be very important. Product variety does benefit customers. Advertising is a benefit to customers because now we have a greater array of choices and products. So if I want the high-end product, I can pay the premium and get it. It also allows for innovation in our market. It allows for companies to constantly be competing for that product quality, for the ability to charge that higher price. And that drive is going to drive for research and development and encourage firms to keep innovating and to keep following what the consumers are voicing with their dollars and what they're voting for in terms of what they want for products. Now let's move on to an oligopoly. So when we go through, and if you're 21, if you're not 21, you can look at my picture here. But if you're 21, you can look at this picture and see when you walk into the beer aisle, there are tons of different kinds of beers. However, it's not necessarily the case. How many different companies actually exist within this market? Well, let's actually look at the concentration ratio for the market for beer in 2015. Anheuser-Busch supplies consumers in the United States with 45% of the alcohol sold. Miller Coors provides 26%, Constellation Brands 13%, and Heineken 4%. So the top four firms are supplying 88% of beer sales in the United States. So even though it sounds like there's this emergence of craft beer, which there definitely is, the top four players in the beer market still control a great percentage of the actual sales in terms of volume. And so again, this is an example of a concentration ratio. We're going to go over another example and another full example in just a little bit. But what we can see from this is that the top four firms, the market, even though there's many different brands as it appears, those brands are all within the same companies, and those top four companies are supplying a significant portion of beer within the United States. So for oligopoly, what we see is there's a relatively small number of firms. So we're going to continue to move away from purely competitive, move away from monopolistically competitive and towards monopoly, and we're going to continue to reduce the number of sellers. As we continue to reduce the number of sellers, it allows firms to have more control over prices. So oligopolies also have control over prices, and it's going to be based on collusion, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. There are entry barriers, so more significant entry barriers than there are with the monopolistically competitive and the purely competitive. There might not be quite as many as a monopoly, but there's some barriers that are preventing new firms from entering into the market. One special case with the oligopoly is that the products can be very similar or homogeneous, or the products can be differentiated. In the case of beer, we have differentiated products. Anheuser-Busch tries to say, my product is better than everybody else's. You should buy my product. Oil is going to be another example of an oligopoly. So OPEC, the oil producing countries of the world, they all are producing oil, and oil, it doesn't matter where it comes from, it tends to be exactly the same product, and that will be a homogeneous product. And so it can be exactly the same, or it can be differentiated. In an oligopoly, it could be either one. And so what we often see is this collusion. The firms within the oligopoly, since there's a relatively small number, they're going to work together to try to keep other companies out, to try and maintain those barriers of entry, and also charge higher prices, so close to those monopoly prices, to take control of the market and try and earn greater profits for their entrepreneurs. All right, so let's go through and really talk about what collusion is. So a collusion is going to be a collusion is the agreement, and it's the cartel is the formal agreement among the producers to set the price and the individual firm's level of output. So there's a cartel that's formed, and they're colluding on the prices. They're setting the prices, so they're maintaining their output levels so that they can maintain a higher price. Firms are going to work together. So an oligopoly, that relatively small number of firms working together to charge the highest possible price, which is the monopoly price. There is incentive for firms to cheat, though. And the incentive to cheat is, what if I charge just a little bit lower than all of my other firms that are with me? If I charge a little bit lower of a price, then I will take more of the customers away from them, and it's going to cause, often what we see, cartels to not work as well as what they had hoped. Collusion is illegal in the United States, so if we have an oligopoly in the United States, it's illegal for them to collude and form a cartel. However, it is not illegal on the worldwide basis, and OPEC, those oil-producing countries, they do have a cartel. So they formed a cartel. They have this formal agreement among producers, and they collude to set the price of oil. They decide how much each country is allowed to produce, and that's going to have a big influence on the price. Again, there is an incentive to cheat, and you can look up news articles throughout the past few years, and you'll see that there have been firms that have, or countries that have cheated and produced more than what they've agreed to, and OPEC then retaliates on those countries. And so there's an incentive there. It is illegal in the United States, so those companies, those beer companies, the top four, they aren't allowed legally to collude in the United States. All right, so I want you to go through these different markets and think about what type of market how would you best describe each of the following markets. And so think about the number of sellers. Think about if they have the ability to differentiate their product, or if their product is exactly the same as all other sellers. How many brands are available? And also advertising can give you a key hint, because advertising is only going to occur in those in-between markets. Only when products are differentiated are we going to see advertising occurring. All right, so I'll give you a few minutes, and then I will go through the answers with you. All right, so hopefully you've paused and you've gone through and determined what you would expect for each of the following markets. So the newest CD from a pop artist is only available at Target. I would consider that Target to have a monopoly on that CD. They are the single seller of that CD. Since it's not available anywhere else, I would definitely say a monopoly. Hotels along the interstate. So I would say, as I'm driving down the interstate, there tends to be, when you get to a city, there tends to be quite a few different hotels, usually in the matter of one or two exits. So I would say there's kind of a lot of, there's quite a few different hotels. So I would say that's going to be more on the spectrum of purely competitive or monopolistically competitive. So the question becomes, do they differentiate themselves? Are they all charging the same price? So I would argue that hotels do differentiate themselves. A Motel 6 is very different than a Hampton Inn or a Hilton. And so hotels try to differentiate themselves, and they say, I'm better, so I can charge more. You should pay more to stay at my hotel. And since there's that differentiation, we start to move into that monopolistically competitive market. Peanuts. A peanut grown on one farm is very similar to a peanut grown on another farm. So I would argue that that's going to be a perfectly competitive market. There's many farmers growing peanuts, and peanuts across farms are very similar. And so peanuts is going to be a perfectly competitive market. Gasoline in a small town. Depending on how small of the town, I came from a town in Iowa where there's only one gas station, so that would be a monopoly. But in a small town where there might be 3 or 4 gas stations, that could cause an oligopoly. It could cause collusion in the market. But depending on exactly how small the town, if there was only one gasoline, there weren't any other towns around nearby, there weren't any other gas stations nearby, it could be a monopoly. But what I would guess this would be an oligopoly. Traditionally, you can drive, even if there's only one gas station in town, there's another one that's close by so that you can get gas. And I would say that that would be considered an oligopoly. Which market type allows for differentiated products or brands? And this would be considered to be both our oligopoly, which can have differentiated or homogeneous products, and the monopolistically competitive market. So those two do have the possibility for differentiated products. A purely competitive market, by definition, does not have differentiated products. All products are exactly the same or very similar. And a monopoly, there's no different brands or no substitutes, and so there aren't differentiated products available. All right, and finally, I said I was going to go over concentration ratio with you. So remember, a concentration ratio is calculated by determining the share, the market share of the top 4 firms, and you are going to sum those market shares together. So the first thing you have to do here in this example is going to be to calculate the market share. And then after you calculate the market share, then you want to interpret and determine which market would best describe this industry. So pause now, go over that, see if you can determine those concentration ratios, and think about what type of market this industry would fall under. All right, so let's go through and look at these examples. And again, forgive my writing. I'm going to try and write as well as I can here. But for industry 1, to determine the market share, what we're going to do is we're going to add up the share of the top 4 firms. So the top firm produces 30 units, then 25, 25, and 20 units. And together that makes up 100 units. So they're producing, the top 4 firms are producing 100 units. And we're going to divide that by the total output of the market, which is going to be 2,000. And when we do that, then we see that the top 4 firms produce 5%. So multiplying that by 5 gives us 5% of the market. So industry 1, the top 4 firms are producing 5% of the market. Industry 2, the top 4 firms are producing 75 units, 75, 75, and 75 units. And that means that they're producing, when we add those together, 300 units. 300 units of the total 1,000 that are available in the market. And when we multiply that to put it into percent form, we see that these top 4 firms are producing 30% of the market. In industry 3, we can add up the top 4 firms, and what we see is there's actually only 3 firms in the market at all. The 4th firm is producing 0, so we know that doesn't even exist. And so the top 3 firms are producing all of the market, and so our concentration ratio here is 100%. And then for our final one, we have 1 firm that's producing all of the market, and again, that is 100%. So I'm pretty sure we can pretty easily determine here that our industry 4 is going to be a, let me see if I can get my control back, is going to be that monopoly. There's one firm, a single seller that's selling all of the market. That's a monopoly. Again, we have a concentration ratio of 100% here, but that's not going to be a monopoly because we have 3 sellers. Since there's a relatively small number of firms, that's going to be an oligopoly. And so it might not be exactly 100% to be an oligopoly, but it is going to be very high and very close to 100%. When we're comparing Industry 1 and Industry 2, we can see that they're both relatively small percentages. However, Industry 1 is a very small percentage, and I would say that that indicates to us that it's a purely competitive market, whereas we could argue then that it looks like there's 4 big players here in this industry, and there are other players, obviously, but they're much smaller. And so these might be your generic brands that would just take up a little bit less of the entire market. And we would argue probably that this is a monopolistically competitive market. All right, and so that concludes the discussion there of our different market types, along with the concentration ratios of looking at how much of the total industry is supplied by the top 4 firms. So hopefully now you've kind of grasped the difference between a purely competitive all the way over to a monopoly type of firm. So there are going to be many firms, or most industries, that are going to fall in between the monopoly and the purely competitive. They're going to be more like the monopolistically competitive and oligopoly. However, there are agricultural products that we might consider to be purely competitive. Monopolies, we might start to think about utility companies. If I want to get water in Columbia, the only place I'm going to be able to get water is from the city of Columbia. I don't really have other options, so we're talking about monopoly. However, most other industries fall in between, and so that's going to be important to remember. But as you're starting to think about what would this most likely look like, I want you to think about the number of firms. I want you to think about differentiation. Do firms in these industries, are they able to differentiate their products, say that my product is better, different than everybody else's? If that's possible, you want to lean towards the middle of the spectrum. If there is no differentiation, if all products are exactly the same, and there's a large number of firms, that's going to be that purely competitive market. All right, so hopefully that concludes that section, this module, actually. This is our last lecture. This concludes the module. Work on that more practice folder for practice before you can finish the quiz. Good luck on your first quiz, and if you have any questions, make sure you see me during virtual office hours.